This is Inline, and you're here for Colin Jones' talk, and it's a bug's life, so please welcome Colin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here after a crazy day of travel yesterday. I'm Colin Jones. I'm the CTO at a company called Eighth Light, and this is a story about probably the strangest bug I've ever run into. And it was this year. It was pretty recent. It wasn't one of these bugs, unfortunately, much less fun, much lower Rotten Tomatoes rating than these. More like this kind of bug, a little more boring, a little more like the kinds that we see day-to-day as developers. So this is the bug report itself. I don't expect you to read this. It's for an open source project, but I think there are a lot of lessons here for the kinds of bugs we hit in closed source work and open source work and all kinds of things. So before we talk about the specific bug, I want to talk a little bit about my approach to debugging in general and some tips that have worked well for me personally in tracking down issues. So there's this great book that I think captures a lot of really great debugging advice as well as tons of other advice. There's this book launched a publisher. It's got a 20th anniversary edition out this year. Definitely highly recommend it. But I want to talk through some of the tips that are in there. So first of all, don't panic, right? We need to be thinking clearly about bugs in order to solve them the right way, rather than just addressing the first symptom and hitting it with a sledgehammer that may or may not solve the underlying causes. It can be hard to do when you're under pressure, like this bird here, but it does help to not panic. We really want to understand the bug before we go into addressing the symptoms. And that often starts with being able to really reproduce the issue, or as they put it in the latest edition, a failing test before fixing code. So in their terms, you might think immediately automated testing. Automated testing is great. I love it. But the important thing here is not what technology you're using, but the fact that you're reproducing the issue. So a failing manual test is fine for these purposes. And then being able to reproduce a bug in your own sort of lab environment lets us work together with something that approximates the scientific method. Stuart Holloway has this great talk, Debugging with the Scientific Method, that I'll recommend. There will be a link at the end. By the way, all these slides are going to be available online, so don't feel like you need to take screenshots or anything. But he outlines his debugging approach in scientific method terms. So building up hypotheses, making observations, experiments, collecting data, making observations on the results of those experiments. So this can be really effective, and this is what I strive for in my day-to-day work. It doesn't always work out as well as I'd hope, but I think it's a smart idea. In any case, the fewer unproved assumptions we can make, I think the more likely that we're going to be able to debug the issue. And the scientific method is great and everything, but we really want these cycles to be super quick. We want to be forming hypotheses, testing them, evidence to support or disconfirm, and then observing the outcomes of those experiments. For me, this fast cycles is a really huge thing when debugging. So another tip, select isn't broken, right? This is where the title of the talk comes from, or the subtitle at any rate. The idea here is that select in this case is an operating system call in a Unix. And the idea is that select's not broken, most likely. Or as a doctor in Maryland put it, if you see hoof prints, you should think horses, not zebras. So maybe depending on your geography in the world, there's some causes that are going to be more likely than others when you have certain observations. So in the case of select, it's probably some application that we wrote. It's probably the thing that changed most recently. It's probably not the fundamental building blocks of our operating system or the things that we're building on top of. Okay, but we're not going to talk about debugging in general. We're going to talk about a specific bug today. So I need to give you a little bit of background on my project where this bug happened. So this project is called Reple. It's a Clojure REPL. It's been around since 2012. What is a REPL and what is Clojure? Clojure is a Lisp on the JVM. A REPL, a read, eval, print loop, is an interactive command line program that you use to type in code, evaluate it in a loop. It's what you're running in Clojure land when you're running line REPL or boot REPL. Reple is the thing that's running under the hood. So incidentally, I was really proud of this name here. I like puns, and this was just the absolute laziest one I could possibly imagine. You see that people pronounced it reply for a long time, and I thought that was hilarious as well. It's not funny anymore, but I don't know, it was funny at the time. But it was a fun project. It had real pain points I was solving. It felt like an itch that I needed to scratch. It was giving me things that I was used to in other language ecosystems like Ruby or Python. and it felt good. It was fun to implement. I was getting better at Clojure, the language. It eventually got added to some popular ecosystem tooling, as I mentioned, and so I had some users who saw some actual value in it and who were helping me to shake out issues and making sure things really worked pretty well for everybody. And this encouragement from users, and it was just really energizing. So this is sort of like a dependency graph here. Lineagen and boot depend on Reply to provide this REPL behavior. But Reply, in turn, really depends on a lot of other code to do its job. So nREPL is some remote code evaluation tool similar to what an editor might use, or a language server sort of thing, where you send off code to some remote process to be evaluated. nREPL does that. SJacket was a tool I used for its Clojure parser. For reasons I won't go into today. Clojure Complete was for deciding what options should be available on tab completion, and JLine 2 really did all of the heavy lifting and command line interactions, and it was really sort of core to what it was built on. So we're used to dependencies. Dependencies are a thing. We see this sort of thing all the time. Create React app has lots of them. But because Reply is really just glue code, like it doesn't do a lot on its own. It really, I think of it as a glue code that really stitches these other tools together. Because of this, any bug reports that I got really meant I was going to need to dig into the surrounding ecosystem and the dependencies that I was relying on and fix issues there. So for each of these bugs that came in or that I discovered myself, I'm doing my best with these debugging tips. We saw earlier, I'm trying to reproduce the issue locally, or I saw it to begin with. I'm collecting information from the code, the symptoms to form hypotheses, to make the changes and test those hypotheses. And in the process, getting faster and faster at those loops and getting better at debugging. So plenty of these issues were super tricky and they took a long time. The cycles were slow at first and they sped up, but more practice and experience sort of helped each one to get a little bit easier. It built some confidence in debugging, and was doing a decent amount of this at work too, so that's where some of this comes from. So at some point, things start to feel pretty okay. Not perfect by any stretch, not perfect today, plenty of ways to improve it, but the horrible looking bugs, the places where things were just a tire fire, got less frequent, and I felt really some sense of pride and accomplishment around it. So I'm feeling a little bit like the sleepy fox at this point, some sense of doneness, accomplishment. The GitHub issues list has grown a little bit with some feature requests, and I feel some guilt and shame around that, but not enough to motivate me to go further. Which I want to say is not necessarily a bad thing when a maintainer gets demotivated in this way. I think we should all have some empathy, and I'm saying this out of self-interest and also because I think it's wise for others. But having empathy for maintainers who are in this state is great. My users have been awesome. People have been nice to me. This is not coming from a place of anger at users. But we have reasons for being this way. I have 2 small kids who are great. JLine 3 is a thing, and it's come out. It depends on a higher JVM version. It's way more featureful. There's a tool that's been built on top of that called Rebel Readline that's way better than my stuff, I think. Better decoupled. It's got better responsibility boundaries. It has better features. And so Reply, at this point, to me, sort of feels kind of done, despite having plenty of active users. But this is sort of how I feel. Okay, so now we've got enough context, and it's time to see the bug report itself and to re-experience this thing. So here's where you come in. I want you all to put yourself in my shoes here. Try to occupy the mental space and the emotional space I was in. In fact, let's look at the fox again before things get real. Okay, very calm. Okay, so the bug, it arrives. It comes into line again with a stack trace. The REPL seems to crash all the time for this user and for several other users commenting down thread. I don't see this bug report because I've turned off notifications for line again a while back. But a couple weeks later, the author of line again, Phil Hagelberg, after some triaging and other folks reporting the issue, pings me to see if I have any ideas. So I start scrolling through the report to see what data is there. And the stack trace, to me, seems like it clearly implicates JLine. If you don't know Java, that's fine. But you can see that here Java I/O and Java.lang are really sort of built-in language things. I'm not going to blame those, but I do see JLine there. So to me, it seems like immediately obvious that it's not a lineagen thing. It must be a JLine, or at least a Reply thing. Maybe Reply's use of JLine is incorrect. The stack trace you can't quite see there, but it's in Portuguese, so I'm thinking in the back of my head maybe some non-US keyboard thing. JLine 2, I remember a while back, had a few issues that only affected specific countries' keyboards. There was an interesting note in the issue report about where it happens the most often. This sounded pretty closure-y to me. Closure's got a lot of braces and brackets and stuff like this. So I'm thinking maybe, probably, again, horses not zebras and select isn't broken. Probably my stuff, probably Reple. And several folks have also left in their comments what they have in common, at least the main thing other than using my software, is that they're all running Ubuntu 18.04, which is a fairly common operating system. So, first things first, want to reproduce the bug. Everybody's in the same mental space, everybody's successful, not panicking so far, I hope. Great, concerned for sure, right? This is not good, it's crashing, but not panicking. So there's a little bit of complexity for me in reproducing. I haven't seen this issue on my Mac OS install, and all the reports seem to be on Ubuntu. That's fine. We've done this many times before in previous iterations. I would highly recommend this practice to have handy a toy virtual machine that you can use to spin up and reproduce other operating systems environments. So I've got one that for Linux and one for Windows. Not tons of different versions, just the basics for me. Fast cycles, I don't want to like tweak something and send it back to users, ask them to test it out because I want to try it myself and get those cycles really fast. So I spin up my Ubuntu VM and I try to reproduce and I can't. Things seem totally fine. Right? I keep at it for a while, different combinations of opening and closing brackets, some nesting, some normal characters in there. Can't reproduce it. Darn it. So it's absolutely true that the code does work on my machine, but it's also, of course, completely unhelpful to the folks that are experiencing this bug. They're having a hard enough time already, and I want to be empathetic really to their experience. Think about how you feel when you're having an issue on your machine and you tell that to a teammate and they say, it works on my machine, and they shrug, right? This feels bad, right? We don't want to respond in this way to folks. So I usually try not to tell people what to do in my talks and in my conversations, but I want to ask you, please don't let yourself say that it works on my machine. Really dig deeper to understand what's different, what it is that's different between your machines. I mean, you can say that, but actually just don't say it. Just go straight to the question. What's different? Okay, so we've hit a bit of a dead end in the script here, right? If I can't reproduce, I'm not panicking, but on the other hand, look, this is me. So I'll definitely need to ask for some help reproducing, but meantime, we can go another direction and really start to think harder about the bug report, possible causes. We can't confirm and verify our hypotheses, but we can at least start to generate them and get like a to-do list of things to try out. Okay, so experience has told us that almost certainly code that I wrote, right? Probably the last thing that got changed. Must be a Reple or JLine bug, I figure. But the weird thing about this one is nothing's been changing recently in either one of these things. Reple has had a few updates to nRepl, but nRepl doesn't seem like the kind of thing that would cause this. Maybe. But let's look closer again at the bug report. Remember there's this opening and closing maps, parentheses, brackets, sort of part of the bug report, which unfortunately seems very familiar to me because I remember a feature in JLine 2 called blink matching paren that JLine 2 again is one of the dependencies from earlier. And yeah, it was me that added that feature. So yeah, the idea here with this feature, blink matching paren, is when you close a parenthesis or whatever, the associated opening bracket will blink to show you what you're doing and what your context is. So this is important in a Lisp because parens can be far apart from each other. Sometimes you hear people complain, oh, Lisps have too many parentheses, it's really annoying. But I think what they really mean is the parentheses are too far apart and it's hard to keep track of them. I don't agree with that, by the way, but that's, I think, was an interesting insight for me recently. Okay, so this was 7 years ago, though. This was 7 years ago. Why would this suddenly start causing issues now? So I go into the code, see what the code looks like. I look at the diff, and I see this terrifying thing. So anytime I see a timeout, I'm going to start getting stressed out because particularly if it's something I can't reproduce, I'm starting to think race condition maybe, right? A timeout is about waiting some period of time to see if something else happens and taking some action based on what the timing looks like. So if the process is running differently, if I/O takes longer, etc., something different is going to happen. So in this case, the details don't matter. JLine essentially peeks at a stream to see if there's a character available or not, and it decides whether to blink the paren or not based on that. So this, to me, feels like a bit of a smoking gun. This is, concurrent stuff is really hard for me and for most people, I think. It was probably me that did this. Some new aspect of the environment is probably causing a race condition. That's my foremost hypothesis at this point. So it's about this time that I started getting somewhat less successful in not panicking. And by the way, it feels really, I don't know, liberating, and I feel really glad that every one of you is now sharing in the responsibility for writing this bug. Thank you for this. Okay, so I still need to be able to reproduce. So we're going to have to, sort of step back and take those long cycles instead. I asked for help reproducing on my issues list. I'm going to have to wait for replies for a while, hoping to confirm that it is this blink matching parens feature. And specifically, I'm asking people to, clone my repo, turn off the blink matching parens feature, run it locally, and see if that solves the issue. So I'm asking them to do the hard work well, it's not hard for them. If it was hard for them, they would be able to fix it. But I want them to reproduce the issue. Okay, so I open a related issue in JLine 2 just to track the issue, ask for help reproducing there in case it could relate back to JLine 2 directly. For other use cases, I don't hear anything back for a few days, and then ran into that issue from SBT. Turns out to be a bad kernel. So, wait, what? A bad kernel. So let's follow this link. Let's see what the SBT folks have found out. So SBT is the Scala build tool. It runs on the JVM2. I learned through this process that it must use JLine. There's nothing in that ticket about blink matching paren, which is sort of weird. But following their link, I really want to prove it here, to myself at least. I can't reproduce the issue, but I really want to understand what's going on so that I have something clear to tell my users in terms of their expectations. So that in turn links to this forum post. This forum post identifies the affected kernels, points at 18.04. I search around the website for a while, and I find another post from a little further back. After lots of debugging and some brief discussion on the Linux kernel mailing list, that's what LKML is, it appears this is the result of a bug introduced into Linux between, in this 2-month window, essentially. So I really want to understand more and really understand how this bug arose. So I want to see the Linux kernel mailing list discussion, in particular because I look at deeper at the forum website, and who are these Spigot folks? What even is this website? It's a Minecraft server. So Minecraft, this kind of blows my mind because my 6-year-old son, Owen, loves playing the demo version of Minecraft on my computer, loves exploring, seeing the different animals. It's on peaceful mode. There's no scary zombies. It's great. So this is sort of making me cry a little bit. So we've got a Minecraft forum as apparently, so far, the canonical source for this Linux kernel bug. I'm failing, I Google for hours trying to find the Linux kernel mailing list discussion for this. I trawl through mailing lists. Do you know how many commits committed the Linux kernel in 2 months? There's a lot, so I'm not going to look at every commit. So my Googling is failing me. So eventually I find out who this user is on this forum website. It looks like maybe the lead author on the website. And ping them to ask them for links and can they help me out? Where's the kernel mailing list? And then of course, as soon as I post this, 30 minutes later, I've rubber ducked here, and you know the idea of rubber ducking, where you talk to an inanimate object like a rubber duck and explain your problem, and you immediately come to your own solution. So I find the right query. It was the username and Linux and kernel on Google. It worked on Google, but not on my usual DuckDuckGo. Go figure. Anyway, I find the Ubuntu kernel bug tracker. So apparently the Ubuntu kernel was missing a specific commit, and they linked to the exact commit. I learned in this process that the kernel isn't like a global Linux thing, or maybe it is in some sense, but what Ubuntu ships as Ubuntu's kernel is not exactly a one-to-one mapping with whatever's in Linus Torvalds Git repo. So Ubuntu, so there might be missing commits, there might be additional commits. A Linux distribution might have different kernels running on it, which is interesting. So tip here, just intervening. In my case, of course, we want to think about how search engines work, use rare words, rare combination of words, but ones that are guaranteed to be in wherever we're looking. So computer bug, we probably all know by this point, is not going to find our issue. Linux kernel bug, also not quite specific enough. A J-line Linux kernel was great, but too rare. It wasn't actually in the thing I was looking for. So I happened to add a username in this case, and that worked. So the Ubuntu kernel bug tracker links in turn to a Linux console mailing list discussion, which I learned is a different thing from the Linux kernel mailing list. Go figure. And the same user has submitted a bug report to the Linux kernel with a very short C program that shows the issue. So points out a potential cause, presented as a hypothesis. Here's what I believe shows the issue. But most importantly, they include a C program, which is great. They go through a little bit of detail in terms of description, in terms of what happened. Which is super helpful, but really most importantly is the simple reproduction case. The really powerful thing about this reproduction case that they've done is to do it in C, right? They've done it in a language that completely eliminates the J-line and library and the JVM entirely as potential causes for this bug, so that the Linux folks don't have to worry about this whole Java ecosystem and who knows what other libraries are depending on here. And they've done it in C, in a language that the Linux kernel folks understand. So in this case, we're not going to go through all the code, but the idea is there's a forked process. There's two processes running in this example program. One is an infinite loop that just touches the TTY, or the terminal, the console, every now and then, every second-ish, forever. And then the other forked process, or the main process that wasn't forked, will, actually I'm not sure whether fork equals 1 or equals 0 is the forked one or not. But in any case, there are processes that fork. One is an infinite loop, and then one, it just waits until you hit enter. So I think a big tip here is great bug reports are going to help bugs get solved faster, right? Omitting everything that's non-essential, right? The J-line, JVM, any other libraries, doing it straight to the essentials, trimming all the fat, and then including everything that is essential. So that it was still I said simple C program, but there's fork and there's some stuff in here, but they need to be able to reproduce it. So in the process, the folks responded pretty much immediately, same day. Like there were 4 responses to this bug. And they immediately, the folks who knew about the issue immediately were able to identify that there was a missing commit in the Ubuntu kernel. And this was the commit. I don't expect you to read this, but here's the key part. This fixing commit optimizes a fast path, but really the important thing is it won't interrupt ongoing I/O on the TTY. Interrupting ongoing I/O is the issue in this case. So the fixed code, which I think is anticlimactic at this point, and again, out of scope for this talk, I think, and really for my own understanding to drill into the implementation details here. But suffice to say that it avoids some extra disruptive locking logic when accessing the TTY in certain situations. And that's what's going to fix our bug, says this mailing list. So we still need to reproduce the issue, right? So now the challenge, we just need to figure out how to run with an affected kernel. No problem. Just install an old kernel version and then I'll check it out. Okay, I'm gonna be honest here. I looked at the instructions for doing this, and I looked at the time I had to spend with my work stuff and kids, and decided that the explanation sort of made sense. The SBT folks could be trusted, and I was going to really let someone who actually uses Linux on the desktop worry about installing the old kernel, confirming for Reple's purposes. I already had this request out for folks. But in the meantime, what do we do to mitigate this, assuming this is true? So one, we can work around the kernel bug in user space and provide an option to turn off this blink matching parens feature. It sounds really annoying, and we're only affecting 2 kernels here, so I'm curious how widespread it is. And then the other option, which is really more my speed, is to just ask people to upgrade their kernels and see whether that flies. So my suggestion is the second, leaving the door open to the first one. And then pretty quickly, I get the best issue comment ever. After updating the kernel, the REPL error just stopped. Thanks. Okay, so wow. So to recap, we've got this closure REPL that has a JLine 2 dependency, which has some concurrency stuff going on that I added, and Ubuntu was missing a Linux kernel commit, and the combination of those things results in a bug that crashes my REPL upon closing a parenthesis for users with these two very specific patch level Ubuntu kernel versions. Oh, and by the way, the kernel commit thing was found by a Minecraft forum server creator. Awesome, awesome person. I will buy this person so many coffees or whatever they prefer. Okay, so as I'm peeling my face off my hand and my desk and everything, what did we learn here? Well, first, clearly, select isn't broken isn't literally true, and the Prag folks didn't mean it to be literally true in their case either. Sometimes a bug really is in a lower level dependency, and the more we depend on as a community, the more likely that is to be true. It's going to be, the more we're writing glue code, the more it's likely a bug is going to be in a dependency. Just like horses, not zebras, isn't literally true, right? This is a common thing for medical folks. You have to keep those hypotheses, those unlikely hypotheses, around until you've ruled them out. So we need to stay open to the possibility of these wacky causes being true. I'm still very, very happy to assume statistically bugs are in my code and have those be the first hypotheses that I test, because almost all of them are. So constructing search queries is critical for us as developers, particularly when debugging. I think, getting lots of repetitions, scanning results for things that look relevant, reading quickly, thinking a little bit about how search engines work, how they prune all of the information in the world down to a small amount of information is by combining words that aren't commonly used together, ideally phrases. And I think for me, this was a big wake-up call to remember not to be too proud to ask for help. Right? I like to think of myself as very capable debugger, and I like to dig into bugs and fix them and have all the glory of fixing them. But you might have noticed in this case, and you might feel a little cheated by this, and I'm sorry if that's the case, but you might have noticed in this case that I did almost zero actual debugging. Right? I wasn't in the code, git bisecting, and I've done lots of that stuff before. And again, sorry if you feel cheated, but it's not about me, right? Like fixing a bug is not about me and it's not about you. It's about the users, right? The users do not care who solves the problem. They just care that it gets solved. So if we can ask for help, get someone else to help us, if we can search and find an answer on the internet, fixing it that way is just as valuable. For me, another really powerful lesson here is that shared ecosystems really give us leverage beyond our own personal abilities. Right? The person who tracked this down to the kernel, this person, was using JLine 2 as well. The person who connected the dots, the SBT person, from the Minecraft forum back to line again, worked on SBT, which also used JLine. Right? Try to imagine how long it would have taken to track this issue down if I or we had rolled our own library for console access instead of relying on this JLine shared library. We might never have found it. I can tell you flat out, I would never have found it, for sure. I would have had to build in a way for users to disable this blink matching paren feature. It would have been a speculative fix, right? I would have had to have folks test it out, make sure it worked, just like I did in the other case. Meanwhile, though, I've got this additional piece of configuration that I need to maintain forever. And blink matching parens, at some point, assuming the Linux kernel issue got fixed, blink matching parens would have started working for new users in that operating system, right? And meanwhile, the people who had turned it off would be missing this, what I think is a valuable feature. It's a nice user-friendly thing. Because they wouldn't know it was fixed, right? We wouldn't be connected to that community. So in this case, despite the Ubuntu kernel, having a bug, I'm super glad I could rely on this large community of folks all using the same tooling to bang out these issues and not have to fly solo on this, or really, like I said, do any of the heavy lifting. So the whole ball game when debugging is to prove what's causing the bug, right? Prove what's causing the bug, and then it's almost always easy to fix it. Comparatively. Not always. I shouldn't say almost always. Often. And the fact that I didn't jump right into changing code saved me some time and angst in the way I described a moment ago. So in my case, I wasn't able to reproduce the issue at first or have exactly the right hypotheses because changing the kernel version literally did not occur to me. Right? So I made an assumption that that I didn't even realize I was making. I assumed a matching Ubuntu version meant that we had all the same operating system stuff going on under the hood, which just wasn't true. But I can promise you next time, I'm going to have a wider range of hypotheses to choose from, and I'm going to assume a bit less. And I think with experience, as we see more and more weird stuff happen, as we share stories about these things, I think we can all assume less and have more hypotheses to choose from. So we can solve problems together as teams and as communities if we don't panic. Remember, you don't have to fly solo. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to panic when we're hit with a strange sounding bug like this. So these slides will be available on SpeakerDeck in about an hour. Also pin them to my Twitter profile. Highly recommend all three of these resources. There are lots of other great ones out there. And got some further reading about the bug if you want to dig into the details here. But thank you very much. Again, I'm Colin Jones, CTO at 8thLight. We're a high-quality software consulting company. We build software together with client teams across all kinds of languages and platforms. I'd love to talk to you later if you're interested in learning more about us. Thanks for your time, and have a great rest of your conference.